Okay, so Assalamu alaikum, hello and welcome. My name is Lindsay Taylor, your host today. I'm the Regional Manager for Scotland for Muslim Engagement and Development. I'm here with Community Policy Forum, which is an independent think tank seeking to promote evidence-based and community-centred approaches to policy making in regards of structural inequality facing Muslim communities in the UK. This podcast, along with the series, can be accessible on YouTube, where you can subscribe to Community Policy Forum. You can also find more information on Community Policy Forum's website and social media platform. Community Policy Forum are doing this podcast to discuss some very topical issues following on from recent rulings and policy changes around the world, including Roe v. Wade in the US and the bikini ban in France. These issues relate to one thing in particular, and that is women's autonomy over their bodies. We will look at this through the lens of Islamophobia, and we have brought together an expert panel of policymakers and academics to discuss this very important issue. Let me introduce our guests. We have Naz Shah, MP, who has been a Member of Parliament for Bradford West since 2015. She previously had the role of Labour Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities and is currently the Shadow Minister for Crime Reduction. Naz is also co-chair of Westminster All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims. Dr. Sarah Faris is a reader of psychology at Goldsmith University of London, with expertise in social theory, gender and the mobilisation of feminist themes by nationalist parties within anti-immigration and anti-Islam campaigns, or femo-nationalism. Sarah has authored several books, including In the Name of Women's Rights, The Rise of Femo-Nationalism, which was published in 2017. We also have Amina Sharif, who is a PhD student at Cambridge University. Her research looks at how gender and racialised street violence against women, Muslim women, intersects with counter-terror state violence. Let's jump straight into our questions. We're going to start with Sarah. What are some of the Islamophobic tropes that have emerged following the overturning of Roe versus Wade in America, please?
Yes, thanks, Lindsay. I would go straight into my answer. So we have seen, in the United States, if you look especially at Twitter and posts that, several people have written on social media, we have seen kind of in good faith, we can say, at the beginning, or the well-intentioned one at least, where comments along the lines, now the United States has been saying for years that it's such a progressive country as compared to Muslim majority countries. And now look, instead, is even more regressive when it comes to women's rights than many Muslim majority countries. So these were among, we can say, the what I would call now the well-intentioned lines. And I say well-intentioned because I'm thinking, for instance, of Trevor Noah and the Daily Show host, who is usually a comedian, who tries to be quite progressive and usually doesn't come up with racist or Islamophobic tropes. And this is one of the things that he said in one of his shows, in his own comedian satirical kind of way, namely that the United States now was even more backward than the Taliban, so something along these lines. And the problem with this kind of well-intentioned lines, and I say well-intentioned because I don't think they fully realize how actually Islamophobic they sound, is that they are fundamentally ignorant. And I say this because obviously while the attempt is to attack US politics at the moment, why the attempt is to attack the Republicans and their misogynist politics now around reproduction rights. What they are doing, in fact, is basically saying, we know that Islam promotes misogynist laws, and now this country is being even more misogynist. But this is entirely untrue. What actually this kind of well-intentioned but badly Islamophobic kind of tropes is actually conveying is pure ignorance, because in the majority of countries, Muslim majority countries, actually abortion is, particularly if the life of women is at risk, abortion is legal. There is no Muslim majority country in which abortion is forbidden if the life of women is at risk. And then, of course, there are many differences actually between the almost 50 Muslim majority countries. There are countries in which abortion is allowed until the 4th month, countries in which it is allowed, depending on there are some restrictions, but it is still allowed until the 40th day since conception. So in spite of all these differences, what is usually protected is the life of a woman. So just to conclude, really, just to say that we can still see Islamophobia and this kind of ignorant tropes, even in those well-intentioned comments that still ignore, and the problem is precisely that in their attempt at depicting the US as regressive, they are still taking Islam as the point of reference when it comes to the lack of women's rights, when actually this is not true.
Thank you so much for that. And it is so true that so often the ignorance around Islam and Islamophobia really does perpetuate Islamophobia and the issues that we're really working to tackle right now. So thank you so much for really looking at that area a lot more in depth there. Amna, to what extent is the new wave of Islamophobia in the US a continuation of the historic Islamophobia that's already there?
Thank you, Lindsay, for that question. I think going back to Sarah's comments that these well-intentioned comments by Trevor Noah evoked these very Islamophobic tropes about Islam and Muslims just goes on to demonstrate how these tropes are so deeply ingrained in the Western imaginary in terms of how they understand the West in relation to Islam. And so we know that these tropes about Muslim women as being eternally subjugated by Islam have long roots and can be tracked back to, as far as colonial knowledge production about the Orient. So, for example, colonial writing was filled with an interest in Muslim women. In these writings, Muslim women were described oftentimes as the possession of Muslim men, living a life akin to death. They were said to live, and I quote here, in a complete state of captivity, as slaves to their husbands, as luxurious animals, clothed in the garments of the grave. So these colonial descriptions, circulating in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, constructed Muslim women as lacking agency, voice, subjectivity, so on and so forth. She was completely objectified. And these views are again sort of reflected in 17th and 18th century, English and French oil paintings in which Muslim women were sort of painted fully naked or diaphanously dressed, waiting the Muslim masters in these richly decorated harems or baths. So again, the genealogy of the trope of the Muslim woman as, imperiled and under Muslim men's rule and subjugation has a very long history. And it's important that we sort of contend with this history to make sense of where these tropes are coming from and how they continue to appear even in as Sarah mentioned, these well-intentioned kind of critiques.
No, definitely, I couldn't agree more. So often people think that Islamophobia is a really new issue, which has only occurred recently, but actually, from what you have just highlighted, it is going back to colonial times. It's going back for a really long time. It is an issue which is definitely predating 9/11 and other kind of historic things that have happened, that people think actually Islamophobia is stemming from there, but actually is stemming from a lot further back. And that's something that we definitely need to consider when we are having the conversations around Islamophobia and how we can really kind of deal with and tackle the issues. Naz, if I can come to yourself now and ask, is there a greater concern just now over the rights of women being curtailed, or for the supposed takeover of Sharia law, which is being highlighted?
First of all, thanks, Lindsay, and thank you for inviting me to speak for this podcast. It's lovely to be amongst esteemed sisters on this. Can I just start by, it was interesting listening to both Sarah and Amina, because there's, for me, being a politician for the last 7 years and the kind of Islamophobic abuse I get, if we're going to take over the country, we're less than 5% of the actual country, aren't we? We Muslims and women are even less, but somehow Muslims are that great. It's that age-old trope of we're going to take over with Sharia law. And I remember being on the Home Affairs Select Committee when we did the inquiry into Sharia councils, and the kind of abuse that you got on Twitter and the tropes were, that Sharia law is coming in. And actually, the first tenet of Sharia is to live by the law of the land that you are in. And in our country, in Great Britain, we have a parliament that makes the law, we have judges, we have a judiciary, we have a system which is the oldest democracy in the world. And I'd argue it's one of the best in terms of their, judicial, as much as there are times when it goes wrong, we are one of the leading examples of how to implement that law and Parliament's law and the sovereignty of Parliament, etc. But yet we're supposed to be taking over with Sharia law, and there's only 5% of us. And somebody once said, it's you've got to laugh at the idea that Muslims are that brilliant, that 5% of us are going to overtake, the rest of the 95% of the country, despite all these established institutions. And that's one of the tropes that is always used against me. I know I see it on my Twitter. You just have to go through the comments on my Twitter to see that. And then there's the idea that, coming back to what Mina was saying, that, Muslim women need rescuing. We need saving from these Muslim men, and we need, and yet, Islamophobia is very gendered, because we know that the attacks are predominantly, the victims of those attacks are women. And if you're visibly Muslim, if you're a hijabi or a niqabi, that rises. And we know that when the Prime Minister called Muslim women, likened them to letterboxes and likened them to bank robbers, the attacks on Muslim women rose by over 375%. And I said this recently in Parliament, the recent experience of Zahra Mohammed, the president of the Muslim Council of Britain, meeting with Penny Mordaunt, and that playing out on the front page of the Daily Mail. But she's been held to account for comments or issues that were, while she was probably, I don't even know if she was born when those things happened. And the boycotting of mainstream Muslim organizations. So these tropes, and going back to Trevor Noah, and they are, and I get the idea of well-intentioned, but it's like that everyday sexism. It's like that everyday racism. It's just become everyday Islamophobia. It's in our public discourse. It's in our political discourse. It's now in our institutional discourse. It's in our media discourse. So what do we do to address it? And the only way we can is to continue to highlight it, continue to hold people to account, but also continue to work with other people, because it can't just be my responsibility as a Muslim to address the inequalities that Muslims face. It has to be a responsibility of the wider community. It has to be a responsibility of everybody. And I always say, you don't have to be black to get racism. You don't have to be a woman to get, feminism. So if we don't have to be back to, a woman to get feminism, then you don't have to wear a hijab. You don't have to be a Muslim to get that Islamophobia is real and to understand the implications of structural Islamophobia. And this is structural now. It's no longer on the periphery of society. It's no longer on the fringes of society. And Baroness Warsi said in 2011, it has passed the dinner table test. And now I'd argue it's the media test, the parliamentary test, whatever test you want to throw at it, it is well and truly established. And I think for us, the concern is how do we grow back from that for the sake of humanity, because it is racism, it's rooted in racism. And the definition that we did as the all-party parliamentary group said it's rooted in discrimination and racism. And that's not about calling Islam a race. It's about our understanding as people that racism is discrimination. And we know that Muslims face discrimination. So, and we are attacked because of our Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. So if you're, the Sikh guy who got killed in America was Sikh, he had a turban, he was wearing a turban, but he was perceived to be Muslim. And bigots don't stop and ask women or men when they're being attacked, whether you are a Muslim and can I proceed to attack you? Bigots will be bigots, and they will, if that is their intention, that is their intention. So I think there's something about, for us as women in positions of power, as from academics to policymakers to policy influencers, we need to have these conversations much more, and it can't be confined. And this is why I welcome this podcast. It can't be confined to 1 month of ending Islamophobia. Just like, yes, we celebrate Black History Month in October, but Black history isn't just about October, it's throughout the year. We celebrate International Women's Day on the 8th of March. Women do not disappear for the rest of the 364 days a year. We are here where part of the population, and Muslims are here. And for me, we are equally British, and there is no conflict between British values and Islamic values. And the sooner people understand that we are equally British, we are equally part of society, and women need to be given the platform. Because, one of the things that really riles me is that even the worst, the Islamophobes, automatically, when it comes to women and their dress sense, they become the best feminists ever. When it comes to women and what they should wear, and women are talked about, whether you should wear, how you wear the hijab, how you wear the burkini, whether you get taken off a beach because you're wearing a burkini. But when do the women actually get heard? Where is the platforming of the Muslim woman wearing the hijab? Where is the platforming of the women who can take a lead? And then the intersectionality of feminism, having that conversation about Muslim women and talking, to them, and they're not even talking to them, they're talking about them without them present at the table. And that is a real worrying concern for me. And I really would want that to be unpicked for women, because women have to, we show solidarity to fellow women. And, these impact on women more than they do men, I'd argue, because it is very gendered.
I can't agree more with how gendered Islamophobia can be, and also just your comments in the end about Islam being very feminist when you put on hijab and never being asked about it, where it's quite often my husband, or I am told that my husband makes me wear the hijab, but actually it was completely and utterly my choice. My husband wasn't even in the country at the time. And to me, Islam gives me back my rights over myself and my femininity. And also, to me, Islam is a completely feminist religion. And I think that's really important, that people understand more about Islam and more about actually what it means. And as we've already highlighted throughout the programme, a lot of Islamophobia and a lot of the issues comes from ignorance and a lack of understanding of what the religion is actually saying and about. And as you said also at the beginning, Muslims are only 5% of the population. And in Sharia law, it says, at the very beginning, it says that we have to abide by the laws of the country that we're in. And if people had a better understanding of things like that, then actually, hopefully, it would help to really address some of the issues that we as Muslims are facing every single day.
I think some of that is also, and you're absolutely right, Lindsay, I think one of the things also for me as a Muslim I'm very, the Quran is my handbook for, feminist handbook, if you like. It gives me the power to be who I want to be. It allows me, my deen is my source of strength. It's my source of inspiration, because far from, when I talked about, how we were projected in colonial eras and the projection of women in their pictures and in the arts and in the cultures. Actually, where are the women who were horse riding and going to battle alongside the men? Where are the women, where are the Muslim women who were, there's no depiction of them unless you're a Muslim and you're familiar with Islamic history and with the role of women in Islam when Islam came about. Where is democracy? There were democratic processes happening more than 1400 years ago when the Khalifa were chosen, when votes were had. And now we talk about modern day democracy, but actually, we've been living this, but it's which lens people choose to look at us through. And as Muslims, we are looked at through a lens of suspicion. We are looked at through a lens of otherism. We are otherized. We are dehumanized. We are, we're fair play. We're fair game for those bigots who want to focus on difference rather than unity. Muslims step up. We did a report around Muslim response during COVID. The first doctors to die in this country were Muslims. The discrimination that people in key frontline workers faced, from people of colour faced, was absolutely appalling. So, it's not that Muslims aren't playing their part. It's not that. And then it's all that anti-immigration narrative also plays into the Islamophobia and where Muslims are coming in. And more recently, it's absolutely right to support Ukraine, absolutely 110%. But then there's a question of, okay, so which lens are we looking at when we're talking about refugees from Syria, when we're talking about when Afghanistan happened? Those are the kind of conversations. Sorry, Sarah, I've seen your hand up, but there's lots of food for thought here, isn't there? And perhaps it's, when we're talking about world wars, we often forget the Muslim contribution to the world wars. And there's lots of projects now which are reclaiming that space. So maybe it's time for us to have some long-term projects about reclaiming our space, our history as women, and those that went before us and whose shoulders that we stand on.
Couldn't agree more with that. And Sarah, can I bring you in there as well, please?
Yes, sorry, I had forgotten about the raise hand function on Zoom. Naz, I completely agree with what you said. And actually, I want to maybe just explain a little bit better what I meant when I used well-intentioned, because I realized that I don't want it to sound like a justification. So I am not trying to justify people like Trevor Noah or other people who more or less locate themselves, we can say, on the, let's say, democratic left, whatever we mean by these anti-Republican space. It was not a way of justifying them. I just think some of these people are using, if you want, a usual tactic, which is a rhetorical tactic, which is the one of pointing at the hypocrisy of a political force when they do something that they are accusing their enemy of. So that was more my point, I guess. But I think it is fundamentally racist. And the problem is precisely that they are using that term of reference, in this case, Islam, as kind of the signifier for being bad, for being the example of lack of women's rights. And then they are using it against the Republicans, when the problem is precisely to be actually more informed about Islam and women's rights. And this is something I study. I'm not Muslim myself. I grew up actually in a fundamentalist Catholic country, which is Italy. And so in many ways, precisely because this law in the United States has been promoted by what is, I would say, basically Christian fundamentalism, I know very well what this kind of Christian fundamentalism maintains when it comes to women's rights. But as a scholar also of Muslim practices and Muslim communities, more than religion, I have to say, I also know that actually there is a fundamental difference between Catholicism, for instance, and some currents of Christianity, not all of them, but some currents of Christianity and Islam. And I have to say that I discovered that, in fact, women's rights are much more respected in many Muslim currents rather than in Christian ones. So it was, I think there is lots of ignorance around Islam in the West, in Europe. And as Amina was saying before, it is really, this ignorance is not new. It's been, since colonial times, there has been this depiction of Islam and the Orient in general as this place or these places in which the women are in fact the victims that can be rescued, and we can say more about that, and the men are the oppressors. So it's a very old colonial trope, which is always there, and it seems to kind of shape this kind of Western imagery that is always there. It's so incredibly deeply ingrained and rooted that, in fact, even people like Trevor Noah just pick from that, thinking that they're doing something progressive to defend women's rights, when in fact they are just in a way nourishing certain Islamophobic tropes. And I also very briefly want to say I have lots of Muslim students, in fact, who come to my classes with a hijab, etc. And for me, it's been incredibly, really, I learned a lot from them over the years. And many of them tell me, when people meet us on the street, they ask us, or even at the university, they ask us, why are you wearing a veil? Why are you covering yourself? Who is asking you to do that? And they tell me, actually, not only it is us who want to do that, but often our fathers in particular somehow discourage us from doing that, because they say, in this country, if you wear a veil, you are going to encounter discrimination. So maybe you should see whether it is convenient for you. But they tell me, we still want to do it because this is our identity. And we don't want, to retreat or do something that goes against our identity and our beliefs. And I think this is, I really respect, I have incredible esteem and respect for these young women, because it is true that they encounter discrimination in this society. And it is true, as Naz was saying, that Islamophobia is very gendered, racism is very gendered, and they are often the first victims of discrimination, also because of the visibility of their clothing, of their veils, etc. But nonetheless, they are incredibly, really brave, and they really want to fight for who they are. And I think this deserves an incredible, really respect, because this is really courage in this kind of climate and society.
Yeah, and definitely can be very difficult for women on a day-to-day basis, just going out in the street and trying to carry on their everyday lives. I mean, when the CPG in Scottish Parliament did their report on Islamophobia, they found that many individuals, including women, had changed their actions, their daily actions, and the way they went around their day-to-day business because of Islamophobia. And I know personally many women who have removed the hijab because it's so difficult to try and wear it on a day-to-day basis outside in the streets and deal with the gendered Islamophobia that they're facing around it. But I'm going to bring in Amina just now, if I can bring you in as well on this.
What I wanted to say was that, Trevor Noah, he wanted to make a well-intentioned critique. And like Sarah, I don't mean to say that the way in which he went about making this critique was well-intentioned, but his critique exposes, very clearly how the West has defined and continues to define itself. It defines itself through the figure of this maimed, brutalized, sequestered Muslim woman who has no rights and voice. And through this objectified Muslim woman, the West is able to construct itself as, lovers of freedom, as having progressed, as places where, sexual radicalism can happen, and so on and so forth. And I think essentially because the West constructs itself so fundamentally through this figure of the Muslim woman, what's happening is that the Muslim woman essentially has come a line, this line that demarcates West and Islam. And this is not an innocent kind of demarcation in the sense that when Muslim women are seen on the street, as Naz mentioned, they are immediately seen as, threats to civilization. When you construct an identity, a civilizational identity, whatever that means, whatever its problems, in relation to Muslim women, in this case, Muslim women are being seen as a civilizational threat. And so, as we know, this is causing Muslim women to be the preferred targets of Islamophobic hate crime. Now, this idea of saving Muslim women and Muslim women as this, eternally subjugated figure is not just a pitiful figure, but it's also a sort of dangerous figure in that sense then, because it represents this threat to civilization. And I think, again, this way in understanding itself has meant that the West has set up Muslim women for increased racial violence on the streets.
No, definitely. And it's very concerning. And actually, I wanted to ask you, what role do you think social media has played in this proliferation of Islamophobia in recent times? Do you think that there is a role that's been played there in social media to kind of reinforce that?
Absolutely. Social media continues to play a critical role in disseminating Islamophobic tropes and narratives. Specifically in the overturning of Roe versus Wade, we saw hashtags such as Sharia law in Texas, Texas Taliban, Talibangelical, and then of course we saw circulating a cartoon of Texan woman dressed in an Afghan-style burqa. So we know that these kind of hashtags actually do very, very well on Twitter because they are sort of amplified by these algorithmic structures. So there was a study conducted on this subject that tried to understand how these Islamophobic hashtags circulate so widely. And this study noted that, these kind of hashtags originate in a few accounts that sort of seed these ideas, and then these ideas are then proliferated by what this study calls amplifiers. So amplifiers are basically these accounts that collect and circulate racist ideas through mass retweets and replies. In other words, they're fake accounts. They are basically bots and what they call sock puppets, and they scale up these initial kinds of Islamic ideas, and they create this megaphone effect, which is to, widely disseminate Islamophobia across the Twitter sphere. So absolutely, Twitter has a very important role in spreading these kinds of ideas, and we have to take Twitter to account for its responsibility in this matter.
No, definitely, and thank you for that. I mean, it is really, it's an area which is not legislated enough, it's not covered enough, and yet it plays a massive part in disseminating information, disseminating these tropes, as you've said, and it's something that we really must look at a bit more. But Sarah, I'm going to bring you in here on looking a bit more at Roe and Wade. So obviously there has been justifiable anger and worry and worry over the overturning of Roe and Wade, but there's been widespread silence on the hijab and niqab bans that are also happening around the world, which is also falling under women's rights in countries such as France. And is this justifiable? Is there an explanation around why there's outrage over one and silence over the other?
I don't think it's justifiable at all. I think the explanation is that, it has, again, deep roots in the ways in which, for instance, the feminist movement or sections of the feminist movement in the West have depicted religion and Islam in particular. And when I say this, what I mean is that I think there has been a tendency, certainly in countries like France, since the early 2000s, when the veil was forbidden in public schools, so young Muslim girls can no longer wear the veil when they go to public schools in France. And then later on in France, as well as other countries, the full veil, the various forms of full veiling were forbidden in public spaces. Certainly in France in particular, there has been a war on Islam, an Islamophobic war in the name of secularism and in the name of women's rights. And many of the feminists who have engaged in this Islamophobic war, really, they do it under the guise of secularism, and saying things such as religion should be out of politics, should be out of public life. What they don't understand is that I believe there is a certain perception and understanding of secularism in our countries and of the role of religion, which is completely different from how Islam, for instance, depicts religion and public life. And what is even more interesting for me is that many of these sections of so-called secular feminism very often do forget to say things such as many Islam majority countries, again, were the first to give women voting rights and political rights, for example, when in Europe, even in secular parts of Europe, these rights were not given. For instance, in Egypt, women could vote already in the early 1950s, and in Switzerland it was only possible like in the mid 1970s. So I like to highlight this paradox because, again, I think that the feminist movement, again, I want to say sections of the feminist movement because it's not all of it, have a responsibility in portraying women's rights as somehow universal rights, but basically representing only the rights of a section of women, which is very often just white and middle class women. But then they tend often to forget the fights of other women, be it Muslim women fighting for their rights, their human right to dress as they please, to follow the religion they want to follow, or even other women's rights. And here I'm thinking part of my work is also on care and domestic workers. Many of these care and domestic workers in Europe, as well as in much of the world increasingly, are migrant women, often from very poor countries, and poor themselves in our European countries, doing jobs such as nannies, caring, domestic work, etc. And these women are increasingly organizing themselves, asking more rights and decent laws for domestic workers, for example. They organize demonstrations, appeals, they are organized in organizations, etc. And many sections of the feminist movement simply forget about them as if they don't exist. So I think this is a problem, has deep roots, again, in colonial times, because, for instance, even in the UK, the suffragette movement, which did lots of great things, but there are, again, parts of that movement that were quite Islamophobic and racist. And for instance, they were quite... the one thing that they really didn't want was for men in the colonies, colonial subjects, as they were called, to have voting rights before women in the United Kingdom. There were many expressions of consternation and shock in the ranks of parts of the suffragette movement when these proposals were made, and they were quite racist if you read them. So this is to say it's not new, and I think it has to do, I really want to stress that this is not the feminist movement at large, because there are lots of sections in what we call at large the feminist movement, the women's movement, that is anti-racist, that is fighting against Islamophobia, that is becoming more and more aware of these issues. It's also about learning many of these things. But there are large sections that I would say I don't want to say the more vocal ones, but certainly the sections that are given more space by the media, for instance, that certainly have a responsibility in putting forward the rights of Muslim women as if they are not the rights of all women, and as if they do not have that status of universality as the other rights, such as reproductive rights, for instance.
True, so true, and so often I hear that, the absolute consternation that I could possibly be a feminist and a Muslim woman at the same time. People are always shocked, and it's like, well, why, when Islam gives me so many rights? And it definitely does feel that in having so many rights Islamically, then on the other hand, so many rights being removed from Muslim women from Western civilizations at the same time is definitely feels like that's what's going on there. And Naz, if I can come to you, I mean, what are the next steps now? What can we do and take in order to challenge such damaging narratives around Islam and women's rights? Like, what can we do to really try and tackle this narrative that's around us now?
Well, we need more research, and we need more sorts of policies in terms of in the space where the decisions are made. So, for example, I chair the Muslim Women's All-Party Parliamentary Group, co-chair that with one of the Tory MPs, Caroline Noakes, who chairs the Women and Equalities Select Committee. So you have to find allies across the House. And there is that, where, like Sarah just talked about, there's that intersectionality of feminism and intersectionality of racism, and that isn't taken into account. So we need to work with our feminist sisters to talk about, you can't have a conversation without us. There's nothing about us without us as Muslim women. So we have to engage in those spaces to be able to take other people along with us. Because the fight is, we haven't got rid of patriarchy. We haven't got rid of a gender pay gap. We haven't got rid of, and this is another layer of ism that we face. And if you're wearing a headscarf, or, if you're wearing the hijab and you're visibly Muslim. So we need to have those conversations. But also we need to have more conversations to empower people, because there's one thing that, and I had this conversation this morning, there's one thing about empowering Muslim women, but the truth is, if you're empowering Muslim women and the system is against them, then it needs systemic intervention, and that systemic intervention is at policy level, it's at select committee level, it's at institutional level, of their institutional understanding. Because if we look at Islamophobia, it is structural now. So to dismantle those structures of Islamophobia, then we have to work at that level where those structures exist, and that is in policies. For example, insurance companies, if you've got a Muslim name, your algorithms are set to, give you a higher quote, and you could be the same person with a different name. The Anna Sawar case where, sorry, not Anna Sawar, it's Hamza's case, the SMP, who was taking his daughter to a nursery, and he's taking it to court now. So there has to be some visibility. There has to be some legal challenges to say this is not okay. And it has to come right from the top, and it has to be a multifaceted approach. It can't just be from the grassroots if we're not being listened to. So we need Muslim representation, and we need that reflective representation of women, visibly Muslim women, in spaces where those conversations happen. So like on this, in this podcast, we have two visibly Muslim women taking part in that. And that is really, really important. It's really important because unless Muslim women see themselves, it's that whole idea of role modeling, etc. But I really, really do feel there is a real space, because we also know, look, I know that there are places in oppressive regimes where girls are forced to wear the hijab. And I get that. And I get that we stand against that. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater whilst you're trying to address those issues of women empowerment. And it's like, don't be selective. My message to institutions is, don't be selective what suits your narrative. And actually, you have to challenge yourself, because the responsibility of addressing the issue of racism and gender Islamophobia and Islamophobia as a whole doesn't just fall on my shoulders as a Muslim. it falls on the shoulders of anybody who buys into the idea of equality. And for me, you can't, I'm a Yorkshire lass and I say this often, you can't be a bit pregnant, you're either pregnant or you're not. You can't be on the side of human rights and women's rights and feminism, but only limit it because it doesn't suit you, and only limit it to women who fit the narrative of who are empowered, because that in itself is a trope. And we need to get rid of these tropes, and we need to challenge these tropes, and we need to call it out. We need to call it out and work with others, because it isn't just my responsibility, and it certainly isn't just yours because you wear the headscarf. It really isn't. So, but I welcome the studies, I welcome the research, and it's about getting it into places where it is discussed and it drops in people's psyche, because racism still exists. We know that the Black Lives Matter movement happened, and it happened. There's conversations that we had these conversations 25 years ago, and this still exists. So what are we doing to take away that structural, inherent, what interventions are we going to make to take that away? And that's our responsibility. So I think this podcast gives a lot of food for thought for me, and I hope it does for your listeners too.
Thank you. And, taking everybody along on a journey to tackle this issue and other issues is so very important for all of us. It's about, as you said, making sure that all voices are heard and that everybody has space on all those different spaces to be heard is so vitally important. So thank you very much. And I would like to thank everybody for listening today, but most importantly, I would like to thank all of our guests for coming along and giving their absolutely amazing insight and knowledge into this podcast, and for being part of the Community Policy Forum podcast series. So thank you so much. And once again, I would like to thank our listeners, and please do follow us on social media so that you can hear the rest of the series. So from the Community Policy Forum, thank you so much.